Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to Mild History, where we slow down and explore the strange, overlooked corners of the past in a calm and thoughtful way. Tonight's story takes us into the homes of the Victorians, a world of polished furniture, flickering gaslight, and objects so unsettling that they feel almost otherworldly today. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, from one quiet room to another across the world. Now let's settle in and step quietly into Victorian Britain, where the line between life and death was never very far away. The Victorian era is often remembered for its elegance: velvet draperies, polished oak furniture, and gaslight flickering across marble mantels. But if you step inside the average Victorian home, especially one belonging to a family with wealth or aspirations, you would quickly discover that these interiors were also filled with objects that might unsettle the modern visitor. The Victorians lived in a world where death was close at hand. Disease, poor sanitation, and industrial accidents claimed lives at every turn. Child mortality rates were high. Epidemics swept through towns with grim regularity. And yet, in the midst of this uncertainty, people also created a culture of extraordinary domestic decoration. A world where the parlor served not only as a place for tea, but also as a stage for rituals of grief, remembrance, and even fascination with the macabre. It was not enough for Victorians to acknowledge death. They often collected it, displayed it, and sometimes even wore it. Objects tied to mourning and remembrance occupied pride of place. Other items reflected obsessions with science, phrenology, and the unseen world of spirits. Still more were simple curiosities: taxidermy animals arranged in lifelike scenes, or household contraptions that strike us now as more disturbing than practical. To the Victorians, these objects were perfectly ordinary. To us, they are uncanny, reminders of how much cultural values can shift in just a century and a half. In this series, we will explore 15 categories of creepy Victorian household objects. Some were tied to mourning rituals, others to medical theories, and still others to the Victorians' boundless curiosity about nature, death, and the supernatural. We will move slowly, one object at a time, pausing to consider not only what it was, but why it mattered. As you listen, you may notice the calm rhythm of these stories. The Victorians themselves lived at a slower pace, under gaslight and oil lamps, with the tick of long-case clocks in their parlors. In this spirit, we will take our time. So let us begin with an object at once beautiful and unsettling, an adornment meant to keep loved ones close, but crafted from the very substance of their bodies. Among the most intimate and unsettling possessions of the Victorian home was mourning jewelry. At first glance, a locket or brooch may appear delicate and decorative, but look closer and you will find woven strands of human hair, carefully arranged into patterns, curls, or even miniature landscapes. Hair jewelry had a long history, but it reached new heights in Victorian Britain. Part of this was due to the influence of Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved Prince Albert died in 1861, she entered a period of deep mourning that lasted for the rest of her life. She wore black clothing, jet jewelry, and accessories that contained fragments of Albert's hair. In doing so, she set a powerful example for her subjects. If the Queen herself clung to relics of the dead, so too could ordinary families. Crafting hair jewelry was a meticulous art. Some pieces were simple, a lock of hair tucked behind glass in a locket. Others were elaborate: bracelets braided from hair strands, or brooches with curls arranged in the shape of a tree, symbolizing the endurance of life. The work could be commissioned from professional jewelers, but many families also made pieces at home, using guides published in ladies' magazines. The symbolism was clear. Hair does not decay in the same way as flesh. To keep a lock of a loved one's hair was to preserve a part of them, something permanent, tangible, and deeply personal. Wearing it close to the body meant carrying their presence, even after death. For modern observers, there is something uncanny about the idea of wearing human remains. But to Victorians, it was an act of devotion and continuity. Children who died young often left behind tiny curls that were made into rings or pendants. Husbands and wives exchanged hair jewelry not only in death, but sometimes even in life, as tokens of fidelity. A Victorian parlor might contain a display case of such objects, visible to visiting guests. Each piece carried a story, each one a reminder that the boundaries between life and death were porous. Mourning was not hidden away. It was worn on the body, woven into daily life. Today, surviving examples of hair jewelry can be found in museums and private collections. They are often strikingly beautiful, intricate patterns that resemble fine lace work. Yet, once you realize what they are made from, they acquire a weight that is difficult to shake. The Victorians lived in a culture where grief was material, tactile, and enduring. To understand their hair jewelry is to understand how they sought comfort in the midst of relentless loss. And from these quiet tokens of love and memory, we move to another object, one that sought to preserve not just a fragment of the body, but the entire face itself. In the corner of certain Victorian homes, often displayed in a cabinet or hung discreetly on a wall, one might encounter a death mask. These plaster or wax impressions were taken directly from the face of the deceased, preserving every line, wrinkle, and feature with startling accuracy. The practice of making death masks was not unique to the Victorians. It stretched back to the Middle Ages and even to antiquity. But in the 19th century, advances in plaster casting made the process more accessible. Families who wished to preserve the likeness of their loved ones could call upon artisans to make a cast shortly after death, before the features changed. The result was both intimate and unsettling. Unlike painted portraits, which might idealize the subject, a death mask captured reality. The closed eyelids, the slack mouth, the stillness of the flesh, all were preserved in exact form. For some families, this provided comfort, a way to hold on to presence in the absence of life. For others, it was a grim but necessary step in the process of remembrance. Death masks were not only personal relics, they also served scientific and cultural purposes. Phrenologists, those who believed that skull shape determined character, collected masks of criminals, geniuses, and political figures. Museums assembled galleries of famous faces. Visitors could gaze upon the likeness of Napoleon, Beethoven, or a notorious murderer, preserved forever in plaster. In private homes, a death mask might rest on a mantel or inside a glass case. Guests might avert their eyes, or they might lean in, fascinated by the closeness of the encounter. It is worth remembering that photography was still in its infancy during the early Victorian years. To possess a three-dimensional likeness was, in some sense, more vivid than a photograph. Today, we find these objects eerie, almost unbearable. To stand before the exact contours of a face long since vanished from the earth is to bridge centuries in a single glance. But for Victorians, accustomed to death as a frequent visitor, such artifacts were part of the rhythm of life. In understanding death masks, we glimpse again the Victorian tendency to materialize memory, to turn grief into something solid, something that could be touched, displayed, and shared. And as unsettling as death masks may seem, they were only the beginning. For in the next chapter, we will turn to an even more haunting practice, the art of photographing the dead, posed to appear as if they still lived. In the age before digital memory, before snapshots on telephones, even before affordable family portraits, photography was a precious and expensive luxury. For many Victorian families, the first time a camera entered their home was not to capture a birthday or a wedding, but rather to record the solemn stillness of death. This practice, known as post-mortem photography, produced some of the most haunting images of the 19th century. To modern eyes, the photographs are difficult to look at. A young child propped carefully in a chair, surrounded by siblings who shift uneasily. A wife arranged on a bed, flowers tucked into her hands, her eyes closed forever. Sometimes the deceased were posed standing, supported by hidden metal frames, to appear as if they were still among the living. In some cases, pupils were painted directly onto the closed eyelids of the photograph, giving the illusion of wakefulness. But to Victorians, these images were not grotesque. They were acts of devotion. Death was so common that a family might have no opportunity to photograph a loved one during life. When smallpox, typhus, or industrial accidents stole people suddenly, the post-mortem portrait became the only visual record. Families treasured these photographs, placing them in albums alongside the living, as if to say, this person still belongs here. The process of taking such images was painstaking. Cameras of the era required long exposures, sometimes minutes at a time. The living had to remain utterly still, which was not always easy for restless children. Ironically, the deceased, being perfectly motionless, often appeared sharper in photographs than their living companions. This produced an uncanny effect. In group portraits, the dead might be the clearest, most focused figure. Studios advertised these services openly. Photographers traveled with the necessary equipment, and manuals offered advice on how to pose the dead with dignity. Infants were often arranged in their mother's arms, as if asleep. Men might be posed in their favorite chairs, books in hand, symbols of their daily life intact. Looking back, the practice illustrates the Victorian refusal to separate death from daily existence. The parlor, the main room of the home, often doubled as the space where bodies were laid out before burial. Friends and neighbors visited, children wandered in and out. Photography was simply one more way of making memory tangible. Today, these images circulate in museums, archives, and on the internet, where they often provoke horror. But to the Victorians, they were comforting keepsakes. When displayed in ornate cases or tucked into lockets, they were tokens of love, as ordinary and cherished as mourning jewelry. It is easy to recoil, but it is also worth reflecting on our own practices. We too use photographs to preserve memory, though we avoid death as a subject. Perhaps the Victorians, in their stark honesty, remind us that memory must sometimes include what is most difficult. From still photographs of the dead, we move to another Victorian fascination: the preservation of animals, transformed into permanent decorations for the home. Step into the parlor of a Victorian middle-class household, and you might notice glass domes on the mantelpiece. At first glance, you see birds, their feathers shimmering with natural brilliance. But then you realize they are perfectly still, their eyes glass, their poses frozen. You are looking at taxidermy, one of the great obsessions of the 19th century. The Victorian age was one of exploration and empire. Ships returned from faraway lands carrying specimens never before seen in Britain. Exotic birds, insects, reptiles, and mammals fascinated both scientists and amateurs. Collecting them, preserving them, and displaying them at home became a fashionable pursuit. Taxidermy had existed earlier, but advances in chemical preservatives during the Victorian era allowed for greater realism. Birds were mounted mid-flight, wings extended. Foxes stood as if about to leap. Cats crouched in hunting poses. The effect was uncanny, the vitality of nature captured, yet forever lifeless. For wealthy families, taxidermy was a way to showcase curiosity and education. A gentleman's study might contain cases of butterflies pinned in neat rows, or tropical birds arranged in lifelike scenes. Museums encouraged this trend, opening natural history galleries where families could marvel at entire ecosystems reconstructed behind glass. But taxidermy also took whimsical, sometimes grotesque forms. Artists created anthropomorphic displays: squirrels dressed as gentlemen, frogs posed as soldiers, kittens arranged around a card table. These displays, intended to amuse, now strike us as unsettling. The line between art and parody blurred, and the results often carried a faint echo of the macabre. For middle-class homes, smaller pieces were affordable. A bird under glass, a fox head mounted on the wall, or even a cabinet of insects became symbols of taste. They reflected not only curiosity about nature, but also the Victorian desire to impose order, to collect, categorize, and display the world, even in death. Of course, not everyone approved. Some critics found the displays excessive, calling them grotesque parodies of life. But they remained popular well into the late 19th century. Queen Victoria herself had a fondness for taxidermy birds, and fashionable magazines published articles praising the craft. Today, many examples survive in dusty corners of antique shops, or in museums where the colors have faded and the glass eyes no longer gleam. Seen through modern eyes, they are eerie. The beauty of nature is preserved, but the absence of life is unmistakable. Taxidermy, like mourning jewelry and post-mortem photography, reflects a Victorian impulse to hold on to what is fleeting. The natural world, so fragile and brief, could be captured and made permanent, even if the result was a shadow of the real. From taxidermy, we move to another kind of Victorian collecting, not of animals, but of objects meant to encapsulate the entire world in miniature: the curiosity cabinet. In many Victorian parlors, tucked against a wall or occupying pride of place, stood the cabinet of curiosities. These glass-fronted cases contained an eclectic mix of objects: seashells, fossils, pressed plants, ancient coins, and sometimes things far stranger. To the Victorians, they represented the wonder of discovery. To us, they often reveal the eerie boundaries of fascination. The tradition of collecting curiosities dated back to Renaissance wonder rooms, but the Victorians embraced it with particular enthusiasm. The 19th century was an age of exploration and empire, when artifacts poured into Britain from across the globe. Travelers brought back exotic shells, ceremonial masks, or fragments of antiquity. Naturalists added fossils and minerals. Families arranged these items carefully, sometimes labeling them with neat handwritten notes. But curiosity cabinets also contained objects that strike modern viewers as unsettling. A dried crocodile, jaws open. A preserved bat pinned beneath glass. Skulls and bones labeled with scientific precision. For Victorians, these were educational, tangible lessons in natural history and the breadth of creation. But displayed in a domestic setting, among teacups and portraits, they could cast a shadow over the everyday. Children were encouraged to engage with these collections. Books and periodicals guided families on how to build their own cabinets, urging them to collect insects, plants, or geological specimens during walks. The home became a miniature museum where learning and leisure blended. At the same time, cabinets often blurred the line between science and spectacle. Spiritualists sometimes added objects connected to séances, planchettes, crystal balls, or fragments said to come from haunted sites. The juxtaposition of the natural and the supernatural heightened the sense of mystery. For the Victorians, the cabinet of curiosities embodied control over a vast and uncertain world. Industrialization and empire expanded horizons, but they also introduced anxieties. To gather the world into a single cabinet was to tame it, at least within the home. Today, when we encounter surviving cabinets, we see not only the objects themselves, but also the values they reflect. They tell us of curiosity, ambition, and a desire to connect with the distant and the strange. Yet, as with taxidermy, they also remind us of death's proximity, bones and preserved specimens serving as silent teachers in the parlor. With the cabinet closed and the household returning to its routines, the Victorians turned their attention to new sciences that promised to reveal truths about human character. And so we move next to the curious world of phrenology, where skulls themselves became objects of fascination. The Victorians loved to surround themselves with objects that promised to reveal hidden truths. Some of these objects were decorative, some scientific, and some balanced uncomfortably between the two. Few embodied this blend so completely as the phrenology bust. These porcelain or plaster heads, carefully marked with lines and labels, stared quietly from the shelves of parlors and studies across 19th century Britain. To us, they may seem quaint, even absurd, but to the Victorians they symbolized knowledge, and in their own way, they could be profoundly unsettling. The birth of a fashion. Phrenology had its roots in the late 18th century, when Franz Joseph Gall, a German physician, proposed that the brain was divided into regions controlling different faculties: love, aggression, language, morality, and so forth. According to Gall and his followers, the relative development of these faculties could be read on the surface of the skull. A bulge might indicate strength in a particular trait, while a hollow might reveal weakness. By the early 19th century, these ideas had traveled to Britain, where they flourished in the fertile soil of Victorian curiosity. The Victorians were living through an age of classification. Naturalists were arranging plants and animals into neat taxonomies. Geologists were mapping the layers of the earth. Even society itself was being divided into classes, professions, and moral categories. Phrenology fit neatly into this world. It promised that the complexities of human character could be mapped, labeled, and displayed as clearly as butterflies in a glass case. The bust as household object. The most familiar artifact of this movement was the phrenology bust. Usually made of white porcelain or plaster, it portrayed a human head, calm and expressionless, with the scalp divided into sections like a puzzle. Each section bore a neat inscription: amativeness, combativeness, benevolence, cautiousness. Together, they formed a map of the human soul, as Victorians imagined it. These busts were not confined to lecture halls or medical offices. They appeared in domestic settings, sitting rooms, studies, even bedrooms. A middle-class family might place one on a mantelpiece, both as a conversation starter and as a symbol of intellectual refinement. Visitors could trace the lines with their eyes, perhaps even joke about which faculties seemed most developed in their host. In this way, the bust functioned both as decoration and as a performance of knowledge. But for children, and perhaps for sensitive adults, the effect could be eerie. The blank eyes stared endlessly, the head seemed both human and not human. And the idea that one's moral worth could be reduced to bumps and hollows was unsettling in itself. Phrenology at work. Beyond mere display, phrenology was sometimes put into practice within the household. Manuals instructed readers on how to examine a friend's or child's skull, feeling for protrusions that might indicate character traits. Parents used it to assess their children, hoping to identify strengths and weaknesses early. Employers occasionally turned to phrenology when considering potential servants or clerks, believing that a well-shaped skull revealed honesty or diligence. There are stories of courtship influenced by phrenology. A young man might have his head examined to prove his suitability as a husband. A woman's faculties of amativeness or philoprogenitiveness, love of children, might be measured and quietly discussed. In this way, the practice seeped into intimate corners of Victorian life. Skull collections. Alongside busts, actual skulls or plaster casts of skulls were sometimes kept in private homes. Collectors prided themselves on assembling sets. The skull of a criminal, the cast of a genius, the likeness of a political figure. These were displayed in cabinets, studied by candlelight, and occasionally shown to guests with a mixture of pride and solemnity. For families unaccustomed to death, such displays could feel morbid. But for the Victorians, who lived with death at close quarters, skulls were not only reminders of mortality, but also instruments of study. To gaze upon the forehead of a murderer or the cranium of a poet was, in their view, to confront the very structure of character. The darker side, phrenology, however, was not just a parlor amusement. It also carried troubling implications. The supposed science was often used to justify existing prejudices. Criminals were said to have certain cranial shapes that revealed their wickedness. Racial groups were compared and ranked according to skull measurements, reinforcing stereotypes and hierarchies. In this sense, the phrenology bust was not a neutral curiosity, but a tool of social control. Magazines published charts comparing civilized and savage skulls, claiming to demonstrate the superiority of Europeans. Employers cited phrenology to explain why certain classes were naturally suited to manual labor. The practice lent a false aura of science to biases that were already deeply rooted. Thus, in the quiet space of a Victorian parlor, an object that looked like a piece of porcelain decor carried within it an ideology that shaped lives and justified inequalities. Phrenology in the marketplace. Part of the reason phrenology became so widespread was its accessibility. Busts were inexpensive enough for middle-class households, and books promised to teach the method in plain language. It was knowledge that seemed democratic, available to anyone who wished to learn. Street phrenologists set up booths at fairs, offering quick readings for a fee. Some even traveled door to door, much like fortune tellers. The line between science and entertainment blurred. Families might invite a phrenologist to their home, where he would examine the guests, run his fingers over their scalps, and pronounce judgments with great seriousness. The scene could be lighthearted, but it also carried a charge of authority. To be told that one had a weakness for destructiveness or a deficiency of benevolence could sting, even if said in jest. Decline and legacy. By the late 19th century, phrenology was increasingly discredited by scientists. Advances in neurology and psychology revealed that the brain did not function in the simplistic way Gall had imagined. Universities dismissed phrenology as pseudoscience, and medical professionals distanced themselves from it. Yet the busts and books lingered in homes. They had become part of the furniture, literally and figuratively. Even today, phrenology busts are collectible antiques. They retain a strange charm, with their neat grids and orderly labels. But they also carry the weight of their history, a reminder of how easily science can slide into prejudice, and how objects that seem harmless can embody unsettling ideas. A calm reflection. As we consider the phrenology bust resting on a Victorian mantle, we see more than porcelain. We see an age grappling with the mysteries of the human mind, eager to classify and control. We see families turning science into parlor entertainment, reducing personality to lines on a scalp. We see the mingling of curiosity and fear, of knowledge and bias. For the Victorians, the bust was a beacon of modern understanding. For us, it is a ghostly relic, a blank-eyed head whispering of misplaced confidence, of secrets written not in bone, but in the culture that surrounded it. And so, the phrenology bust joins our growing gallery of Victorian objects, strange, unsettling, and profoundly revealing of the world that cherished them. When we think of a Victorian home, we imagine dark wood furniture, patterned wallpaper, gaslight, and perhaps the smell of coal from the fire. What we do not always picture are medical instruments, gleaming metal tools, sharp blades, glass syringes, and curious contraptions that we would expect to find in a doctor's surgery rather than a family parlor. Yet, throughout the 19th century, many households possessed such objects. They were stored in small cases, tucked into cupboards, or kept in plain sight. For the Victorians, medicine was not confined to hospitals. Much of it unfolded at home, and the presence of these instruments is one of the more unsettling aspects of daily life in the period. the home as hospital. To understand why medical instruments were found in ordinary homes, we must remember the limited role of hospitals at the time. In the early Victorian era, hospitals were few and often associated with poverty. Many families preferred to care for the sick at home, surrounded by relatives. Doctors were expensive, and their visits were brief. Midwives, local healers, or family members often performed much of the actual care. This meant that homes had to be prepared. A fever might strike suddenly, a wound might require immediate attention, or childbirth might come in the middle of the night. Without quick access to professional facilities, instruments had to be close at hand. The Victorian household was, in a sense, a miniature hospital, improvised, intimate, and deeply reliant on its own tools. Bloodletting instruments. One of the most common medical tools in circulation was the lancet. This small, folding knife, often carried in a pocket case, was used for bloodletting, the ancient practice of cutting a vein to release blood. By the 19th century, the practice was already controversial, but it persisted. Families believed that letting blood could ease fevers, balance the body's humors, and relieve pain. Some households also owned scarificators, mechanical devices with multiple blades that could be released with a spring, producing neat parallel cuts. The patient's arm or back would be quickly incised, and cups applied to draw out blood. To modern sensibilities, such objects feel barbaric. To the Victorians, they were tools of care, instruments of healing. It is worth imagining the scene. A child burns with fever. A parent opens a polished wooden case, takes out a gleaming lancet, and with trembling hands makes a small cut in the skin. A bowl is placed beneath to catch the blood. The act is both tender and violent, a parent trying desperately to save a life, using methods passed down through centuries. Cupping sets. Another common household set was the cupping kit. This included glass cups, sometimes with brass fittings, used to create suction on the skin. Heated quickly with a flame, the cups were placed against the body, drawing blood to the surface. Wet cupping involved first making small cuts with a lancet, then applying the cup to draw blood outward. Cupping was believed to treat lung diseases, digestive problems, and pain. Families practiced it at home, sometimes guided by manuals or advice from local healers. The marks left on the skin, round bruises, were signs of treatment. Today, we still see similar marks in modern cupping therapy, though stripped of its original Victorian intensity. Syringes and scalpels. More advanced households kept syringes, made of glass and metal. These were used not only for injections, which were just beginning to be understood, but also for irrigating wounds or administering enemas. The instruments gleamed with precision, but were difficult to sterilize. In an age before germ theory was widely accepted, syringes often carried as much danger as healing. Scalpels and small surgical knives also appeared in domestic collections. While major operations were left to surgeons, households were sometimes forced to perform minor procedures, lancing boils, cutting abscesses, or removing splinters and small growths. Manuals instructed readers on basic techniques, blending medical authority with household practicality. Midwifery and gynecological instruments. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in Victorian life. Hospitals were often feared for their high rates of infection. So many women gave birth at home, attended by midwives or family doctors. This meant that instruments associated with childbirth sometimes lived in the household itself. Forceps, long metal tongs designed to grip and guide a baby's head, were sometimes kept by midwives who traveled from house to house. Families might store them between births. Other instruments included pessaries, dilators, and speculums, tools that feel uncomfortably intimate to us, yet were part of the hidden reality of Victorian domestic life. To imagine such objects resting in a family cupboard is to feel the strange intersection of the ordinary and the clinical. They were symbols of both hope and fear. Hope for a safe birth, fear of the many complications that so often claimed lives. Quack devices and electrical cures. The 19th century was also the age of quackery. The Victorians were fascinated by electricity, and entrepreneurs sold strange devices promising miraculous cures. Hand-cranked generators delivered mild shocks, marketed as invigorating. Belts studded with magnets claimed to heal weakness. Small devices, sometimes no larger than a pocket watch, were sold to stimulate the nerves or recharge vitality. Families bought these instruments eagerly, displaying them in parlors as symbols of modern science. Guests might even try them out, passing the handle around and laughing nervously at the jolt. To us, they seem absurd, but they carried the same promise that modern gadgets do: hope in technology, faith in progress. The atmosphere of the sick room. To picture these instruments in the Victorian home is also to imagine the atmosphere they created. A parlor transformed into a sick room. Curtains drawn, the smell of carbolic acid or vinegar in the air. Instruments laid out on a tray beside the bed. A mother with a lancet in hand, a father winding a small electrical device, a midwife preparing her forceps. The room became a place of tension, filled with both care and fear. Visitors might enter quietly, glance uneasily at the gleaming tools, and whisper their concern. Children might peer at the instruments with morbid fascination, half afraid, half curious. The objects carried weight not only in their function, but in the emotions they summoned. Survival and risk. The presence of these instruments reminds us that Victorian families lived in constant negotiation between survival and risk. Every tool had the potential to heal or to harm. Bloodletting might relieve a fever, or it might weaken a patient fatally. A syringe might cleanse a wound, or it might introduce infection. Forceps might save a baby, or they might injure both child and mother. Families knew these risks, but they also knew the alternative, doing nothing. In a world where doctors were distant and hospitals dangerous, instruments at home were a form of empowerment. They gave families the means, however crude, to fight for survival. The afterlife of instruments. Today, many of these instruments survive in museums and antique shops. Their polished metal and ornate cases seem oddly beautiful, yet they also repel us. We recognize their history, and we sense the fear and hope they carried into countless homes. To hold a Victorian lancet is to imagine the trembling hand of a parent, desperate to save a child. To see a cupping set is to imagine the burn of the flame, the hiss of glass against skin. To look at a pair of forceps is to recall the cries of childbirth, the thin line between life and death. These objects are ghosts in metal and glass, haunting reminders of a time when medicine lived beside the hearth. The presence of medical instruments in Victorian homes tells us much about the age. It tells us of limited hospitals, of reliance on family and community, of the blending of domestic and clinical life. It tells us of courage, families willing to act in the face of illness, and of vulnerability as they risked harm in pursuit of healing. Most of all, it tells us of intimacy. These instruments were not distant technologies. They were touched by mothers, fathers, children, and midwives. They were part of daily life, hidden in cupboards but ready at a moment's notice. They belonged to the home as much as the teapot or the clock. And so, when we imagine the Victorian parlor, let us remember not only the velvet curtains and the polished furniture, but also the lancet in its case, the syringe in its box, the forceps waiting quietly in a drawer. They are part of the true texture of Victorian life, unsettling, yes, but profoundly human. If there is one feature of the Victorian home that unsettles modern readers more than most, it is the quiet presence of poisons. They were everywhere, in cupboards, drawers, pantries, and even woven into the very fabric of wallpaper. To walk into a Victorian household was to enter a world where the line between medicine and toxin was thin, and where ordinary bottles could carry extraordinary dangers. Arsenic, the ubiquitous poison. At the center of this story is arsenic. Today, we think of arsenic as an infamous poison, the substance of murder mysteries and courtroom dramas. But in the 19th century, arsenic was astonishingly common. It was used to kill rats, mice, and insects. It was used as a base for cosmetics, in certain soaps, and most disturbingly as a pigment in dyes. The vibrant green wallpaper that adorned many Victorian parlors, known as Sheely's green or Paris green, contained arsenic compounds. When damp or exposed to heat, these wallpapers released toxic dust and fumes. Families sat beneath them, children played against them, and servants scrubbed them. Illness and death followed, though at the time the connection was not always understood. In powdered form, arsenic was sold openly by chemists. Housewives bought it in small amounts to scatter for vermin. It sat in the same cupboards as flour and sugar, sometimes in nearly identical jars. Mistakes happened. Newspapers frequently carried reports of accidental poisonings. A cake baked with arsenic instead of sugar, tea brewed with a poisoned spoon, children swallowing powder left carelessly within reach. Deliberate poisoning, but arsenic was not only an accidental danger. It was also the poison of choice for deliberate harm. Tasteless, odorless, and easily obtained, it became the weapon of countless crimes. Court records from the era are filled with trials of men and women accused of slipping arsenic into food or drink. Sensational cases gripped the public imagination. Inquests were described in lurid detail in newspapers, and poison panic swept through communities. Ordinary domestic bottles, medicine phials, spice jars, wine decanters became objects of suspicion. Women, in particular, were often associated with poisoning in Victorian lore. Without access to brute violence, they were imagined, sometimes fairly, often not, to turn to subtle means. The archetype of the poisoning wife haunted the Victorian imagination, feeding both misogynistic fears and genuine anxieties about the accessibility of arsenic. The poison cabinet. In response to these dangers, some households invested in what became known as the poison cabinet. These were small, often beautifully crafted wooden boxes with compartments for bottles. They were designed to be locked, their contents clearly labeled. A responsible householder might keep rat poison in one corner, laudanum in another, and cleaning acids in another still. But not all cabinets were secure. Keys could be misplaced, bottles could be borrowed, and servants or children might gain access. The very need for a poison cabinet speaks volumes about Victorian life. Dangerous substances were so common in the home that a dedicated piece of furniture was required to contain them. Laudanum, the everyday narcotic. Another frequent occupant of these cabinets was laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. It was one of the most widely used medicines of the Victorian age, prescribed for coughs, colds, pain, diarrhea, sleeplessness, and even infant teething. It was cheap, potent, and freely available at chemist shops. Bottles of laudanum sat on mantelpieces, bedside tables, or within cabinets. Parents administered it to restless children, often with tragic results. Adults used it to dull pain, sometimes slipping into addiction. Writers and artists, including figures like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey, described its effects in detail, blending fascination with horror. The ordinary appearance of laudanum bottles, glass, with paper labels and cork stoppers, belied their potency. To handle one was to hold both comfort and danger. Families relied on it, but they also feared it. Overdoses were common, whether by accident or design. Inquests frequently reported on individuals who had taken a draught too much of the tincture, and the blurred line between medical treatment and fatal poison loomed large in the public imagination. Other substances, arsenic and laudanum, were not alone. Victorian households also kept bottles of chloroform, used to sedate patients or soothe coughs. Mercury-based treatments were used for skin conditions, despite their toxicity. Carbolic acid, employed as a disinfectant, could burn the skin if mishandled. Even cosmetics contained harmful substances, lead-based powders for whitening the face, belladonna to dilate the eyes. Each of these bottles, stoppers, and jars was a quiet threat. Some wore ornate labels, others were plain. They mingled with medicines, perfumes, and culinary ingredients. The boundaries between safety and danger were porous. The atmosphere of the poisoned home. To imagine the presence of these substances is to feel a subtle tension in the Victorian home. The parlor, with its heavy drapes and ticking clock, might conceal a locked cabinet containing powders that could kill. The kitchen, with its smells of bread and broth, might also hold a tin of arsenic on a shelf. A child's cradle might be rocked by a mother who had just taken a dose of laudanum for her own pain. The danger was quiet, constant, and intimate. Unlike a dramatic accident or a visible illness, poison was invisible until it struck. Families lived with a low hum of unease, whether acknowledged or not. Public debate and reform. As cases mounted, public debate grew. Campaigners called for stricter regulation of poisons, for clearer labeling, and for safer packaging. Gradually, laws were introduced requiring poisons to be sold only in labeled bottles, often with distinctive ridges or textures to prevent confusion. Chemists were required to keep records of sales, and certain substances were restricted. Yet, even with reforms, poisons remained part of Victorian domestic life. They were too useful, too entrenched, to be eliminated. Families continued to live alongside them, balancing convenience with risk. Symbolism and cultural impact. The ubiquity of poison also shaped Victorian culture. Novels, penny dreadfuls, and newspapers alike were filled with tales of poisoning. Arsenic became a literary device, a symbol of hidden malice lurking in respectable households. The locked poison cabinet became a metaphor for secrets, repression, and the dangers hidden beneath polished surfaces. In a way, the Victorian obsession with poison mirrored the larger anxieties of the age. Industrialization, urbanization, and empire were transforming society rapidly. Beneath the surface of progress lay dangers, environmental, social, and moral. Poison, quiet and invisible, became the perfect emblem of these hidden threats. The legacy of the cabinet. Today, antique poison cabinets and laudanum bottles survive in museums and private collections. To modern eyes, they seem strangely beautiful: polished wood, ornate labels, delicate glass. But their beauty conceals danger. Each artifact is a reminder of lives lost, of accidents and crimes, of the fragility of domestic safety in an age of uncertainty. When we see one, we are reminded that the Victorian home was not only a place of comfort, it was also a place of risk. Children played beside arsenic wallpaper. Mothers sipped laudanum beside their infants. Cabinets contain the means to heal, to soothe, and to destroy. The story of arsenic and poison cabinets is not merely a tale of danger. It is also a tale of trust, routine, and adaptation. Families lived with these substances not because they were reckless, but because they had few alternatives. Poisons were tools, blunt, imperfect, and risky, but sometimes the only tools available. As we picture the Victorian home, let us remember the quiet cabinet in the corner, its key hidden in a drawer. Let us imagine the careful hands measuring powder, the anxious eyes watching a child swallow a spoonful of medicine, the hushed tones at an inquest when the bottle was produced. These scenes remind us of the closeness of life and death, of comfort and peril, in a world both distant and strangely familiar. And so, as we close the door of the poison cabinet, we turn to another unsettling corner of Victorian life, the world of children's toys, where innocence and eeriness often walked hand in hand. When we think of Victorian childhood, images of nurseries come to mind: rocking horses, dollhouses, and shelves lined with toys. Yet behind this sentimental vision lies another reality. Many of the toys cherished by Victorian children, especially dolls, strike us today as eerie, unsettling, even nightmarish. Their glass eyes, porcelain faces, and rigid bodies sit uneasily with modern notions of innocence. To step into a Victorian nursery was, in some cases, to enter a gallery of objects that blurred the line between plaything and ghost. The doll as companion. For centuries, children played with simple toys: wooden figures, rag dolls, carved animals. But the Industrial Revolution, with its mass production and new materials, transformed play in the 19th century. Porcelain and bisque allowed for the creation of lifelike faces. Glass eyes, painted with delicate precision, gave dolls a sense of presence. Fine clothing, often miniature versions of adult fashions, completed the effect. To Victorian parents, such dolls represented refinement. They taught children about clothing, manners, and domestic roles. To the child, the doll was a companion, a confidant, sometimes even a substitute sibling in an era when infant mortality loomed large. But to us, these dolls seem far from comforting. Their expressions are fixed, their eyes gleam too brightly, their porcelain skin is cold. Age has only heightened the effect: cracked faces, missing limbs, faded gowns. What once symbolized life now whispers of decay. Dollhouses and domestic training. Alongside individual dolls were dollhouses, miniature homes filled with tiny furniture and figurines. These were not merely toys, but tools of education. Girls were expected to learn the management of the household, and dollhouses allowed them to practice in miniature. Tiny kitchens, parlors, and bedrooms reinforced social roles, teaching children to replicate the world of their parents. The effect was both charming and chilling. A dollhouse might reflect the perfect Victorian home, complete with carpets, curtains, and even miniature poison bottles for the kitchen. It was play, but it was also indoctrination. In this sense, the dollhouse was less a world of imagination and more a rehearsal for adult life. Some dollhouses survive in museums, their rooms frozen in time. To peer into them is to see a Victorian dream made small, and to sense the weight of expectations placed on children. Automaton toys. Not all toys were static. The Victorians, with their fascination for mechanics, created automaton dolls, figures that moved when wound with a key. Some played music, others nodded their heads, others opened and closed their eyes. For children, they were wonders of technology. For us, they seemed deeply uncanny. One can imagine a child winding a doll and watching as its glass eyes flickered open, its head tilted stiffly, and a faint tune played from within its chest. The line between toy and life blurred in ways that could delight or disturb. The nursery as a haunted space. It is worth pausing to consider the atmosphere of the Victorian nursery. These were often rooms set aside for children, filled with toys, books, and furniture scaled to smaller bodies. The walls might be decorated with cheerful prints, the shelves lined with games. Yet the nursery was also a place of solitude, where children spent long hours under the supervision of servants or governesses. In the quiet of evening, as gaslight flickered and shadows stretched, the rows of dolls must have seemed alive. Their eyes caught the light, their stillness suggested watching. A child might whisper secrets to them, or might pull the blanket over their head to avoid their gaze. The nursery was both a sanctuary and, in some respects, a stage for uncanny presences. The dark side of innocence. The creepiness of Victorian dolls is not only a matter of aesthetics. It also reflects deeper cultural truths. Childhood in the Victorian era was not the sheltered paradise we sometimes imagine. Many children worked in factories or mines from a young age. Disease claimed countless lives. Even in wealthier families, childhood was shadowed by discipline, duty, and the constant possibility of loss. The doll, with its fragile body and porcelain face, symbolized this fragility. Children loved them fiercely, but they also saw them break, chip, and shatter. In this way, the doll became a mirror of mortality. Dolls in literature and culture. Victorian literature sometimes reflected these anxieties. Ghost stories featured dolls that seemed alive, toys that harbored spirits, or nurseries that became sites of supernatural visitation. The association between dolls and eeriness was already forming, long before modern horror films exploited it. Magazines also printed sentimental tales of children speaking to their dolls, often in the shadow of illness or death. The doll became a vessel of emotion, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling. Other toys, rocking horses, puppets, and masks. Dolls were not the only uncanny toys. Rocking horses, with their glass eyes and carved wooden bodies, often appeared in nurseries. Their rigid stillness between rides, combined with their sudden violent motion when played upon, made them strange hybrids of life and object. Puppets and masks also carried a charge of eeriness. Puppet theaters were common entertainments, but the painted faces and exaggerated features could frighten as easily as amuse. Masks, worn for play or for festivals, blurred identity in ways that unsettled. Even simple marbles or spinning tops could take on strange qualities in dim light, their movements unpredictable, their colors shimmering. For a child alone in a nursery, these objects could seem alive, animated by forces beyond understanding. Broken toys and memory. One of the most haunting aspects of Victorian toys today is their survival. In museums and collections, we often encounter them in broken form. A cracked porcelain face, a missing arm, a rocking horse with its mane worn away. These objects carry the marks of childhood long past. To gaze upon them is to feel both tenderness and unease. They remind us of children who once laughed, cried, and dreamed, children now long gone. The toys outlasted them, becoming ghostly witnesses. Why we find them creepy today? Our reaction to Victorian toys is shaped by distance. We live in a world of plastic and plush, of bright colors and safety regulations. To us, porcelain dolls with glass eyes feel alien, even threatening. But to the Victorians, they were symbols of love and refinement. The creepiness lies not only in the objects, but in the gulf between their world and ours. At the same time, the dolls and toys of the era reveal truths about Victorian life. Its intimacy with death, its emphasis on discipline, its blending of beauty and fragility. They are eerie because they are honest, because they show us a childhood less sheltered, more shadowed than we might expect. As we leave the Victorian nursery, we carry with us the image of shelves lined with dolls, their eyes gleaming in gaslight. We hear the faint creak of a rocking horse, the winding of an automaton, the whisper of a governess telling children to sleep. The room is filled with innocence, but also with unease. Victorian toys remind us that childhood has always been complex, mingling joy with fear, play with shadow. They are not merely creepy relics. They are windows into a world where children grew up surrounded by objects that taught, comforted, and occasionally frightened. And so, when we think of Victorian childhood, let us remember the dolls and toys, companions of play, but also silent witnesses to a world where life and death, innocence and eeriness were never far apart. The Victorians lived in a world filled with shadow. Science advanced rapidly, railways crossed the land, factories rose in cities, telegraphs carried words at lightning speed. Yet, even as they embraced progress, they also longed to pierce the veil between life and death. The age was one of rationality and of spirits, of microscopes and of séances. And within many Victorian homes, quietly placed in parlors or tucked into drawers, one could find the tools of this supernatural pursuit. Spirit boards, planchettes, crystal balls, and séance paraphernalia. These objects, strange and unsettling, tell us much about Victorian life. They reveal grief, curiosity, hope, and fear, all bound together in glass, wood, and ink. The rise of spiritualism. The story begins in America in the 1840s with the Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York. They claimed to communicate with spirits through mysterious rappings, knocks that answered their questions. News of their séances spread rapidly, and within years, spiritualism had become a movement. By the mid-19th century, it had crossed the Atlantic. Britain embraced it eagerly. The Victorians, living in a culture saturated with mourning, found comfort in the possibility of reaching departed loved ones. The Civil War in America, the Crimean War, epidemics in Europe, all left families desperate for connection. Spiritualism promised that death was not an ending, but a doorway. In parlors across Britain, families gathered by candlelight. The table was cleared, chairs arranged, hands joined. A medium spoke softly, inviting the spirits. And on the table lay the tools: the planchette, the alphabet board, the slate, the crystal ball. The planchette. Before the Ouija board became famous, there was the planchette. A small wooden device, often heart-shaped, mounted on casters with a hole for a pencil. Participants placed their fingertips lightly upon it, and the planchette seemed to move across paper of its own accord, scrawling words and messages. To believers, the movements came from spirits guiding human hands. To skeptics, they were the result of unconscious motion. Either way, the effect was uncanny. Imagine a family sitting in silence as the planchette scratches across the page, forming words that seem to come from nowhere. In the flicker of gaslight, with the hush of expectation in the air, even the most skeptical heart might stir. Planchettes were sold widely in Britain. Stationers and novelty shops offered them alongside writing materials. Advertisements described them as both scientific instruments and amusements. Some families treated them as toys, others approached them with reverence. Today, surviving examples look simple: plain wood, a hole for a pencil. Yet their history imbues them with unease. They are artifacts of longing, of grief given shape in trembling letters. Spirit boards. Closely related to the planchette was the spirit board. Participants placed their hands on a sliding pointer, known as a planchette or indicator, which moved to letters on a board marked with the alphabet. Messages could be spelled out, slowly and eerily, as the group watched. Though the modern Ouija board would not be trademarked until 1891, Victorian homes already hosted similar devices. Boards with letters, numbers, and the words yes and no were common. Families used them in dim parlors, asking questions of departed relatives. The power of the spirit board lay in its ordinariness. It was made of wood and ink, simple materials. Yet, in use, it transformed into a portal. It invited the unseen to spell out words in the midst of everyday life. A message spelled by candlelight might carry the weight of eternity. Crystal balls and mesmerism. Other households favored crystal balls, polished spheres of glass or quartz. Mediums gazed into them, claiming to see visions of the dead or glimpses of the future. The practice, known as scrying, had ancient roots, but Victorians revived it with new fervor. Crystal balls often rested on small stands, displayed openly in parlors. Guests might be invited to peer into them, to test their own sensitivity. The smooth, cold surface, catching reflections of lamplight, created an atmosphere of mystery. Alongside crystal balls, mesmerism, the practice of inducing trances through passes of the hand, sometimes overlapped with spiritualism. Mesmerists claimed to heighten sensitivity, making mediums more receptive. In the hush of a Victorian home, with curtains drawn and neighbors unaware, such experiments carried both excitement and unease. Séance paraphernalia. The full séance often required more elaborate tools. Slates were used for spirit writing, with messages appearing between them while clamped shut. Trumpets, hollow cones of tin or cardboard, amplified spirit voices. Tables themselves became instruments, tilting, rapping, or levitating under the touch of participants. Some households even kept special séance tables, lightweight and designed to move easily. Curtains were arranged to darken the room. A bell, a musical box, or a candle might serve as additional instruments of communication. For many Victorians, these gatherings were not marginal amusements but central rituals. They offered hope, connection, and a sense that the home itself could be a bridge between worlds. The atmosphere of a Victorian séance. To understand these tools, we must imagine the atmosphere in which they were used. A parlor, its gas lamps turned low, curtains drawn against the night. Family and friends gathered, their hands resting lightly on a table. The medium speaks softly, asking for silence, inviting the spirits. The room grows still. The ticking of the clock seems louder than before. The planchette begins to move. The alphabet board spells out words. A trumpet rattles faintly in the corner. A slate, opened afterward, reveals faint chalk writing. The participants murmur in awe, some weeping quietly, others skeptical but shaken. This was the Victorian séance, intimate, emotional, and deeply dependent on its tools. Fraud and exposure. Of course, not all was sincere. Many mediums were exposed as frauds, their tools revealed as tricks. Planchettes guided by unconscious hands became deliberate manipulations. Trumpets were moved by threads. Slates were tampered with. Newspapers delighted in these exposures, yet spiritualism endured. For every fraud unmasked, another medium appeared. For every skeptic who laughed, another grieving mother clutched at hope. The tools of the séance retained their power because they answered a need that science could not. The need to believe that love survived death. Children in play. Strikingly, some Victorian children used planchettes and boards as casual amusements. What adults approached with solemnity, children treated as games. This, perhaps, is one of the eeriest images. Children in a nursery, giggling as a planchette scrawls crooked letters, unaware of the grief-laden origins of their toy. For them, it was another curiosity in a world of rocking horses and dolls. For us, it is another reminder of how thin the line was between play and the supernatural. Cultural resonance. Spirit boards and séance tools seeped into Victorian culture. Novels and plays referenced them. Satirical cartoons showed earnest families spelling out messages from beyond. The fascination was so widespread that even Queen Victoria is rumored to have attended séances, though accounts differ. For some, these objects symbolized progress, proof that new sciences could uncover the unseen. For others, they symbolized folly, a willingness to be deceived. But in both cases, they carried weight. They were never merely wood, glass, or paper. They were bridges to the invisible. The persistence of spiritual tools. Even after the Victorian era, spirit boards and séance paraphernalia persisted. The Ouija board became a commercial success in the early 20th century. Spiritualist churches formed, keeping alive the practices of their 19th century predecessors. Today, planchettes and crystal balls still surface in antique shops, their polished surfaces gleaming faintly beneath dust. To hold one is to feel history pressing close. It is to imagine the trembling fingers of a widow, the eager curiosity of a child, the hushed awe of a family gathered by lamplight. The object becomes a vessel of memory, haunted not by spirits but by the people who once longed to hear them. Spirit boards, planchettes, crystal balls, these were not monstrous or grotesque. They were simple domestic objects. Yet in the Victorian home they carried profound weight. They reflected grief, curiosity, and the human hunger for meaning. They blurred boundaries between play and prayer, science and superstition. For the Victorians, they offered comfort in a world of constant loss. For us, they offer eeriness, reminders of how far people will go to touch what is gone, and how easily ordinary objects can become charged with longing. And so, as we close the séance, extinguish the candle, and set aside the planchette, we step back into the calm of the parlor. The tools rest quietly in their drawers, waiting. They whisper of an age when even the simplest household object might serve as a bridge to eternity. Time ruled the Victorian household. The tick of the clock, steady and unyielding, filled parlors and corridors alike. But Victorian clocks were more than practical devices. They were symbolic, reminders of mortality and the relentless passage of life. Alongside them, many homes displayed objects even more direct in their message. Memento mori artifacts, crafted to remind the living of death. Together, these objects turned ordinary domestic interiors into spaces haunted by the awareness of life's brevity. The household clock. Victorian homes contained clocks in many forms. Tall, long-case clocks standing in hallways, ornate mantel clocks perched above fireplaces, and smaller carriage clocks gleaming on shelves. These timepieces were prized possessions, symbols of order and respectability. To own a fine clock was to display wealth, punctuality, and discipline. Yet clocks also carried a quieter weight. Their ticking was constant, inescapable, and for many Victorians it became a sound that shaped the rhythm of daily life. Children grew up falling asleep to the ticking of a clock in the next room. Servants timed their duties by the chimes. Families gathered when the hour struck for meals, prayers, or visitors. The steady sound reminded all who heard it that life itself was measured, second by second. Clocks and death. In Victorian culture, clocks were often associated with death. Folklore suggested that clocks should be stopped when a family member died, lest they trap the departing soul or bring bad luck. Many households followed this practice, halting the tick during mourning and restarting it only when rituals were complete. Stories circulated of clocks stopping at the exact moment of death, as if time itself bowed to mortality. Newspapers occasionally reported on such coincidences, adding to the aura of mystery. Families told tales of mantel clocks frozen forever, their hands fixed at the hour a loved one passed. These associations meant that clocks, while ordinary, carried a whisper of the uncanny. They were guardians of time, but also silent heralds of its ending. Memento mori, remember you must die. Alongside clocks, Victorians also surrounded themselves with more direct reminders of death. The phrase memento mori, Latin for remember you must die, had long inspired art and devotion. In the Victorian age, it took on new forms, often woven directly into the home. Memento mori jewelry was common, especially among the middle and upper classes. Rings, brooches, and pendants bore skull motifs, coffins, or inscriptions such as in memory of. Jet, a black fossilized wood, became especially popular for mourning jewelry, prized for its somber sheen. Photographs, too, sometimes carried memento mori themes. Portraits of the deceased were framed with inscriptions, serving as daily reminders of mortality. Some families even displayed skulls or bones in cabinets, either as medical specimens or as symbolic objects. Hair art and memorial frames. One of the most distinctive forms of Victorian memento mori was hair art. Locks of hair from the deceased were woven into intricate designs, framed under glass, and hung on walls. Some resembled wreaths, others delicate flowers, others geometric patterns. These pieces were both personal and unsettling. To a visitor, a frame of woven hair might look decorative until they learned its origin. Then, suddenly, it became an intimate relic, binding grief to beauty. Such artifacts blurred the line between ornament and mourning, between love and the macabre. Skulls, skeletons, and symbolic objects. Not all Victorians embraced sentimental memorials. Some preferred stark symbolism. Small skulls carved from ivory, miniature skeletons displayed in cases, and paintings featuring hourglasses and bones reminded viewers directly of mortality. These were less about mourning a particular person and more about reflecting on the universal certainty of death. For some families, such objects encouraged moral living. They served as reminders to act with virtue, to prepare for the afterlife, to keep life's brevity in mind. For others, they were curiosities, part of the Victorian fascination with the macabre. The atmosphere of the parlor. Imagine a Victorian parlor. The mantel clock ticks steadily, its pendulum swinging behind glass. Beside it stands a framed wreath made from human hair, glinting in lamplight. A jet brooch lies on a side table, ready to be worn by a widow at church. A guest enters, notices the objects, and feels a ripple of unease. The room is warm and genteel, yet it carries the quiet presence of death. This atmosphere was not accidental. Victorians lived with mortality more openly than we do. Infant mortality, epidemics, and industrial accidents brought death close to home. Memento mori objects made that presence visible, tangible, part of everyday decor. Clocks as inheritance. Clocks often served as heirlooms, passed down through generations. A long-case clock in the hallway might have belonged to grandparents, its ticking carrying echoes of past lives. Families invested emotion in these timepieces, winding them carefully, dusting them weekly, listening to their chimes as though they were voices of continuity. When a death occurred, the clock became a relic of memory. Its ticking reminded survivors of the person who once tended it. Its chimes recalled evenings now gone. In this way, even an ordinary household clock became a memento mori, binding time to loss. Scientific and religious intersections. Victorian fascination with memento mori reflected both religious conviction and scientific curiosity. Christianity emphasized preparation for death, encouraging reminders of the fleeting nature of life. At the same time, science, with its skull measurements, anatomical studies, and fossils, filled homes with literal bones and skeletons. Together, these influences made the presence of death objects ordinary. A parlor might contain both a phrenology bust marked with benevolence and a clock stopped at the hour of death. The sacred and the scientific mingled, reinforcing the same message. Life is brief, death is certain. The eeriness of survival. Today, when we encounter Victorian clocks and memento mori artifacts, their survival feels eerie. A clock that once ticked in a family parlor now stands silent in a museum. A hair wreath, carefully woven by grieving hands, hangs behind glass, its maker long forgotten. These objects outlasted the lives they were meant to memorialize. To see them is to feel the presence of absence. They remind us not only of death, but of the persistence of memory, lingering in wood, metal, and hair. Cultural resonance. Clocks and memento mori also seeped into Victorian culture. Poets wrote of time as a relentless river. Painters included skulls and hourglasses in domestic still lives. Even children's literature carried gentle reminders of mortality, teaching young readers to live morally and prepare for eternity. This cultural saturation ensured that every tick of a clock, every glance at a morning brooch, reinforced a worldview where death was not hidden but acknowledged daily. As we leave this section, let us picture once more the Victorian parlor. The clock ticks softly. The hair wreath gleams faintly in the evening light. A widow clasps her jet brooch before leaving for church. Each object speaks, not loudly, but with steady insistence. Remember, you must die. To the Victorians, these reminders were not morbid. They were part of life's fabric, woven into its rhythms. To us, they may feel unsettling, even creepy. But they also invite us to reflect on the passage of time, on the endurance of memory, and on the ways in which objects can carry the weight of mortality across generations. The Victorian household was filled with objects that we might recognize today: teapots, lamps, clocks, but also with things that seem startlingly strange, even unsettling. Among the most curious of these were cages, traps, and odd contraptions that blurred the line between practical necessity and eerie presence. Some were used to contain animals, others to control pests, and still others were inventions whose purposes now seem puzzling. To step into a Victorian home was to encounter not only beauty and refinement, but also a world of odd devices, some cruel, some ingenious, and many disturbing to modern eyes. Bird cages and the caged song. Birds were common pets in Victorian Britain. Canaries, finches, and parrots added color and sound to the parlor. Families placed them in ornate cages, often made of brass or wood, and hung them in windows where the birdsong mingled with the sounds of the street. But the cages themselves, with their narrow bars and delicate swings, evoke a certain unease. Birds lived their lives confined, fluttering in spaces far smaller than the skies they were born for. Visitors admired their songs, yet the spectacle was one of captivity. Some cages were extravagantly designed, shaped like miniature houses or towers, with domed tops and intricate ornamentation. In these cases, the cage became less about the bird and more about the display. The living creature was reduced to part of the decor, a moving ornament in a gilded prison. For children, the caged bird was often a source of fascination. But for modern observers, the sight of these ornate cages, often preserved long after their occupants died, feels haunting. They remind us of a culture that valued beauty, even at the cost of freedom. Mousetraps and pest control. If birds were treasured, mice and rats were feared. The Victorian home, with its food stores, coal bins, and wooden structures, was constantly vulnerable to rodents. To combat this, households used a wide array of traps. Some were simple snap traps, not unlike those still used today. Others were elaborate, designed with wheels, levers, and mechanisms that displayed Victorian ingenuity in miniature. Glass jars with trap doors, cages with spring-loaded entrances, even devices that drowned rodents in water, all found their place in cupboards and kitchens. To a visitor, stumbling across one of these traps in the corner of a room must have been unsettling. It was a reminder that beneath the polished surface of domestic life, infestations lurked. The parlor might gleam with brass and velvet, but in the kitchen, a trap waited silently for a victim. The traps, many of which survive in museums, have an eerie quality even when empty. They are small machines of death, designed for efficiency but carrying an aura of cruelty. In their brass fittings and polished wood, they are as much artifacts of Victorian design as teapots or candlesticks, but their purpose was far darker. Insect traps and flycatchers. Rodents were not the only pests. Flies, mosquitoes, and other insects plagued households, especially in cities where sanitation was poor. To combat them, Victorians used glass flycatchers, bulbous containers filled with sweet liquid to lure and drown flies. These sat on tables or hung from ceilings, catching pests while serving as odd decorations. Other households relied on sticky flypapers, strips hung near windows that trapped insects in their glue. Children often found them grotesque, with dead flies accumulating in rows. These devices, though practical, created unsettling sights in otherwise genteel interiors. A parlor with lace curtains and polished furniture might also contain a glass jar filled with floating insects, or a strip of flypaper heavy with corpses. Beauty and death mingled in strange harmony. Odd contraptions for health and safety. Beyond pest control, Victorian homes sometimes contained contraptions intended to improve health. Some were based on genuine medical theory, others on quack science. Ventilation devices, odd respirators, and water filters were sold to anxious families. Many looked strange, with tubes, wires, and levers, their function unclear to the casual eye. One particularly eerie object was the baby cage, a wire structure that could be attached to a window, allowing infants to be placed outside for fresh air. Photographs survive of babies suspended several stories above the ground, peering through wire mesh. To Victorians, this was healthy. To us, it looks perilous and bizarre. Other oddities included foot warmers shaped like miniature stoves, devices to trap chimney soot, and peculiar exercise machines meant to improve posture or stimulate circulation. Many now seem impractical or even dangerous, yet they occupied ordinary homes, blending into the fabric of life. The atmosphere of odd devices. Imagine stepping into a Victorian home as a guest. You are shown into the parlor, where a bird sings faintly from a brass cage. On the mantel, a glass flycatcher gleams, half filled with drowned insects. In the corner near the skirting board sits a mousetrap cocked and waiting. You make polite conversation, but your eyes drift to these objects. They are not meant to be sinister, yet they carry an air of unease. They remind you that beneath the politeness of tea and conversation lies a constant struggle against pests, illness, and discomfort. The home is refined, but it is also embattled. Household cruelty and Victorian values. These objects also reveal Victorian attitudes toward animals and the natural world. Birds could be confined for beauty, mice destroyed without question, flies drowned in jars. Compassion existed, but it was selective. The emphasis was on control, over nature, over pests, over the body itself. This reflects broader Victorian values. Industrial society prized order and discipline. The home was expected to mirror these virtues. Cages, traps, and contraptions were part of this effort, keeping chaos at bay. Yet their presence introduced an undercurrent of violence and unease. The survival of oddities. Many of these objects survive today, preserved in museums or antique shops. Bird cages without birds, mousetraps long empty, glass flycatchers still faintly stained. To see them is to feel a mixture of fascination and discomfort. They are beautiful in their craftsmanship, yet grim in purpose. The baby cage, in particular, strikes modern viewers as chilling. To imagine a child suspended outside a window in a wire box is to confront the gulf between Victorian assumptions and our own. What they saw as healthful, we see as reckless. Cultural echoes. These odd household objects also echo through literature and culture. Writers described cages and traps as metaphors for confinement and danger. Poets used clocks, traps, and cages as symbols of mortality. Even in children's stories, animals caught or confined reflected anxieties about control and loss. The presence of such objects in homes reinforced these themes daily. They were not just tools, they were part of the cultural language of Victorian life. As we close this section, let us picture once more the Victorian home. A cage in the window, a trap in the kitchen, a strange contraption for health in the hallway. Each object was ordinary then, yet now it unsettles us. They remind us that Victorian life was not only about beauty and progress, but also about containment, struggle, and odd solutions to everyday problems. The cages and traps of the Victorian household speak softly, but their message lingers. Life in that age was never as serene as the polished furniture suggested. Beneath the surface lay constant tension, embodied in objects that are now as haunting as they are fascinating. The Victorian world was filled with contradictions. It was an age of invention, elegance, and empire. Yet it was also an age of soot-filled cities, overcrowded slums, and staggering mortality. To modern sensibilities, it can seem almost paradoxical that a society so devoted to refinement and respectability was also so steeped in the imagery of death. But for Victorians, the macabre was not an intrusion, it was a companion. They lived with it, decorated with it, even found comfort in it. To understand why, we must step into the rhythms of their daily lives and see how the macabre became ordinary. Death was everywhere. The most obvious reason lies in the sheer frequency of death. Life expectancy in Victorian Britain was dramatically shorter than ours. Infant mortality was especially high, Families expected, grimly, to lose children. Epidemics swept through towns: cholera, typhus, diphtheria, tuberculosis. Industrial accidents claimed fathers and brothers. Childbirth claimed mothers. Every family, no matter how wealthy, lived under the shadow of loss. Death was not a distant possibility, it was a likely presence. In this context, reminders of mortality were not shocking, they were familiar. Memento mori objects, mourning jewelry, death masks, these were not eccentricities, but extensions of daily reality. Where we moderns often hide death away in hospitals and funeral parlors, Victorians encountered it in their homes. Parlors doubled as viewing rooms for the deceased. Children played near coffins. Families sat with their dead for days before burial. To live in such a world was to accept death's constant company. Religion and the afterlife. Religion also shaped Victorian attitudes toward the macabre. Christianity emphasized preparation for eternity. Death was not only an ending, but a passage. Sermons reminded congregations weekly that life was short, judgment awaited, and heaven or hell lay beyond. Symbols of death, skulls, hourglasses, coffins, were not meant to terrify but to guide. They were prompts for moral living. To wear a brooch in the shape of a coffin was not necessarily morbid. It was a declaration of faith, a reminder that salvation lay beyond the grave. This religious framing softened the macabre, even made it comforting. Mourning rituals reinforced the idea of continuity, that the dead were not lost but transformed. Hence the popularity of spiritualism, with its séances and spirit boards, offering reassurance that communication was possible across the veil. Queen Victoria's example. The cultural embrace of mourning was also profoundly shaped by Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died in 1861, she withdrew into mourning that lasted the rest of her life. She wore black clothing for decades, surrounded herself with memorials, and kept Albert's memory central to her reign. Her example set the tone for the entire nation. If the Queen lived surrounded by mourning symbols, so too could ordinary families. The culture of bereavement became not only accepted but fashionable. Mourning jewelry, black attire, and memento mori objects multiplied, their macabre associations softened by royal endorsement. The macabre is beauty. Victorians also saw beauty in the macabre. Hair jewelry, woven into wreaths or delicate brooches, transformed remains into art. Skulls and bones, carved from ivory or arranged in patterns, became curiosities to admire. Taxidermy, often involving lifelike or whimsical animal displays, decorated parlors. To them, these objects were not grotesque but elegant. They combined grief with craftsmanship, mortality with ornament. The macabre was not separate from aesthetics, it was part of it. The very act of transforming death into beauty gave control over something otherwise uncontrollable. Science and curiosity. The 19th century was an age of scientific curiosity. Anatomy, geology, and archaeology all fascinated the public. Dissected bodies, fossilized bones, and ancient skulls appeared in museums and even private homes. What we might find unsettling, Victorians found thrilling. Phrenology busts, skeletons in cabinets, and medical specimens were not unusual decor. They reflected both intellectual interest and domestic fashion. The macabre thus blended with science, losing some of its sting. Death became an object of study, something to be catalogued and understood. The Gothic imagination. Literature and art also fed the Victorian appetite for the macabre. The Gothic novel flourished, with tales of haunted castles, restless spirits, and uncanny doubles. Poets wrote of death and mourning in sentimental tones. Painters created images of funerals, graveyards, and spectral figures. These cultural works reflected and reinforced public fascination. They made death dramatic, romantic, even entertaining. Families read ghost stories aloud by lamplight. Newspapers carried lurid crime reports. The macabre was not hidden but celebrated, woven into entertainment as much as devotion. The home as theater. The Victorian home itself became a stage for the macabre. Mourning customs dictated how long drapes were drawn, what colors of clothing were worn, even what jewelry was acceptable. A widow's appearance signaled her grief to the world, turning private sorrow into public display. Objects, too, played their part. A stopped clock, a hair wreath, a portrait of the deceased, all were visible signs of mortality. Visitors could not enter a parlor without encountering reminders of death. The home was not only a sanctuary of life, but a theater of loss. Control through ritual. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorians embraced the macabre because it gave them control. Death was constant, unpredictable, and devastating. But through rituals, objects, and symbols, they could frame it, manage it, even domesticate it. A poison cabinet turned danger into order. A mourning brooch turned grief into ornament. A séance turned longing into conversation. In each case, the macabre was not denied but incorporated, made part of life's texture. This contrasts with our own tendency to distance ourselves from death. For Victorians, repression was not possible. Integration was the only way forward. The atmosphere of acceptance. Imagine once more the Victorian household. A mantel clock ticks steadily, its chimes reminding the family of passing hours. On the wall hangs a hair wreath, woven from the locks of a lost child. A book of ghost stories rests on the side table. Outside, a funeral passes in the street, its carriages draped in black. No one finds this remarkable. Death is not an intruder. It is woven into the fabric of daily life. The macabre is not frightening but familiar. It is both feared and cherished, a reminder of loss and a source of meaning. The Victorians embraced the macabre because they had to. Death was too close, too constant to be ignored. But beyond necessity, they found in it beauty, comfort, and even identity. It shaped their homes, their art, their rituals, and their imaginations. To us, their objects seem eerie. Hair jewelry, poison cabinets, death masks. To them, they were part of love, memory, and faith. The macabre was not an escape from life, but a way of affirming it. And so, when we look back on the Victorian embrace of the macabre, we see not only morbidity, but resilience. We see a culture that faced mortality head-on, and in doing so, created objects and rituals that still fascinate us today.